You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears stayed patient with the free agent offensive line market and ended up landing them some pretty good value with Lucas Patrick from the Green Bay Packers. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Hopefully your first listen every day. On the show today, an update to the Chicago Bears offensive line. James Daniels leaves, signs with the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Bears instead sign from the Green Bay deal, worth about half as much per year, and overall much more team-friendly and affordable, good value on the offensive line. We'll break down Lucas Patrick as an offensive lineman, what we saw from him in Green Bay, what his fit was on that offensive line with Bears offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. We'll look at the departure of James Daniels, the rest of the free agent offensive line market, and how that's all going to fit on the Chicago Bears offensive line, as well as more of a bigger picture look at the Bears free agent approach, which started out with a big defensive tackle signing and then seemed to slow down a bit on Tuesday, and we'll kind of see how the rest of free agency plays out from here. But instead, it kind of took until later in the evening, into the nighttime, when the Bears finally made their second official, technically third official free agent signing, was offensive lineman Lucas Patrick from the Green Bay Packers. The team also signed a linebacker Nicholas Morrow from the Las Vegas Raiders, who we'll break down at some point here. But I think Lucas Patrick comes in a little bit more top of mind here with the offensive line change that's now official with this Bears offensive line, because James Daniels is now a Pittsburgh Steeler. Lucas Patrick comes in as a Chicago Bear. And it's not specifically a one-to-one replacement there, right? It's not the whole, I don't think that'll be the whole plan, but it is same day, same transaction, same position, right? Lucas Patrick was not the Packers' planned every down starting offensive lineman, right? He kind of came into the season and the last two seasons as sort of their utility man, backup, versatile interior offensive lineman who just ended up starting 24 games in 2 seasons because they had injuries and COVID and other issues on that Packers offensive line, to where he is needed to play multiple positions up front. So like this past season, for example, 2021, he started week 1 at left guard, then was on the bench for the next 3 games. And then weeks 5 through 18, he played center. And in that week 18 game, he actually played both center and right guard, and then started the divisional round, their first playoff game, their loss against to the 49ers. He started that game at right guard. So this past season, he played all 3 interior offensive line positions, but let's see, looks like 822 of his 967 offensive line snaps at the center position. The year before, it was a lot more of each guard spot. He just happened to be needed more at center this season for Green Bay, but has shown a decent proficiency to be able to play any of the 3 spots. And the Bears end up getting him for a 2-year deal worth a total of $8 million a year. That would be then, or $8 million total. So that would be $4 million a year. I believe the year 1 salary of $4 million is fully guaranteed. So all that money is coming his way, but that's, less than half of what the Steelers paid James Daniels. He got a 3-year, $26.5 million deal. So just under $9 million a year, if my math serves me correctly there. Lucas Patrick, not the same type of exact young and ascending player that James Daniels is. James Daniels is only 24. Lucas Patrick is 28. I think he'll turn 29 just before the start of this next regular season. And of course, Lucas Patrick was not, again, intended to be the Packers' every down starting offensive lineman this past season, but he filled in that role and played well, right? He was a good spot starter off of the bench for them, right? He was not playing at a Pro Bowl caliber level. There were mistakes. There were moments of, above average and moments of below average play, right? This is not a top flight offensive lineman that the Bears are signing, but it is an offensive lineman that has familiarity with the offensive coordinator, Luke Getsy. his offensive scheme, his personnel. Certainly got the Aaron Rodgers approval as his center for the majority of the season, and can be, I think, a competent, quality starting offensive lineman in this Chicago Bears lineup. And I think you've seen some Packers fans kind of bemoan losing him, which is always a good sign too. And, if teams lose a guy or fans lose a player and they say, oh, thank goodness we didn't sign him for that much or whatever, then they kind of then you start to scratch your head a little bit and say, was that a good signing? But the Packers were seemingly not thrilled with losing him. And I thought Matt LaFleur, the Packers head coach this past season, had a good quote about the value Lucas Patrick played in that offensive line, being able to play any of those positions and fill in admirably.
Lucas is just, he's kind of the glue guy, man. He holds that whole group together. He brings that grit, that toughness, the way he competes, the way he cares about his teammates. And he's been doing it for our whole time here, really, together, especially the last 2 years. So I think Lucas is playing at a really high level. And, we're fortunate that we have a lot of great people in that room.
That quote from Packers head coach Matt LaFleur late in the season, I want to say like late December, when he was talking about the role that Lucas Patrick plays in this group. And I think at the very least, right, you have a good value offensive line signing with some great versatility to play center or guard. And much like, James Daniels, except that I think Lucas Patrick gave you some really quality play at center this past season. And last year, 2 years ago, I guess, 2020, was pretty reliable at guard, right? We're talking like average starter quality offensive lineman for $4 million a year. Really, it's a 1 year guaranteed. And then the second year, a second $4 million deal in that second year would be pretty good value if you can get him to be a consistent starting offensive lineman for this Bears team. And that would seem to be where they value him as a better value, cheaper, but still good enough addition to this Bears offensive line to replace the loss of James Daniels. We'll kind of look at where he fits into this offensive line combination and how the offensive line market has played out so far next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bar. I have not had a protein bar that tastes better than a Built Bar, because Built Bars don't taste like other protein bars. Some of the other products can be kind of like chalky or cardboard-like and just hard to swallow and chew down, but Built Bars really do taste like candy bars. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. So it really does satisfy my sweet tooth, but I'm not getting a bunch of sugar that I don't need and a bunch of calories that I don't need either, because Built Bars are all low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. Most flavors are around 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 17 grams of protein. It is the perfect combination for me when I want a little extra protein. It fills me up and gives me that sweet like dessert that I get to have as a special treat that feels like cheating. It really does. It tastes that good. It sounds too good to be true, honestly, when you think about it, but I've eaten Built Bars for literally more than a year now, pretty much one a day. I always get another reorder, get my boxes filled up, make sure I always have some in my pantry. Highly recommend it personally, and you got to try it for yourself. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. We're seeing the Chicago Bears offensive line rebuilt a little bit here, right? James Daniels signs with the Steelers. Lucas Patrick comes in. And like I said, it can be and could be a one-to-one direct replacement there. James Daniels leaves. Lucas Patrick comes in at right guard. But I have a feeling that Luke Getsy may want him to be the Bears center. And I think his flexibility will also be critical to that, right? That was one of the issues that we've had over the past couple seasons with the Cody Whitehair, James Daniels thing, where too often it felt like the Bears would like put him at one position and then like, for whatever reason, have to switch one of them to center and back to guard and back and forth. And they didn't necessarily have that stability to sit at one spot, really master that muscle memory and also the players next to you and have that cohesion in an offensive line unit, right? It's really important that they have a lot of snaps together to get that next level of comfort with the guys next to them, to know their physical strengths and weaknesses, how quickly they move, how close proximity you need to be to my left tackle to help against this speed rusher versus my center to help against this defensive tackle, and all those little like things that you can't measure, you can't like practice. I mean, you practice it, I guess, over time, but you can't like You just need time and it's like a directly repeatable drill type thing. I mean, it's just something that you need a lot of time to do. And so Lucas Patrick, I think, gives you some flexibility to where he has played at a high level at both positions or a starting caliber level. Let's make sure we're sort of categorizing this properly, right? He's not playing at a Pro Bowl level at either position, but like starting caliber guard or center to where you could have Lucas Patrick, say, starting out, compete with Sam Mustipher at center, right? And then if Sam Mustipher happens to take another step this offseason and then looks better than the struggles we saw from him this past season, new offensive line coach, maybe the messaging gets through or tells him some things a little bit differently than previous coaches or whatever it might be. If he takes some steps forward and can maybe say win that competition at center and remain the starting center, then you could put Lucas Patrick at right guard and start him there. Or, you have potential competition at right guard with maybe Larry Borom moving in from the offensive tackle, right? We heard earlier this offseason that Ryan Poles wants this Bears offensive line in general to be lighter and more agile, move more quickly. And I think that could lead to maybe a different right tackle in there because Borum's more of a heavier physical tackle. Move him inside the guard like perhaps he was projected coming out of the NFL draft. And all of a sudden, his lack of mobility is less glaring at tackle than it is compared to the guard because guards don't have to quite move as much. They don't have as much space to move. So that speed is a little bit less visual, less apparent, and maybe he might move a little bit better compared to guards than he does compared to other right tackles. And so you could sort of have this like 3-man thing. I'm saying sort of as the team stands right now, there could very well be another free agent center, guard, or tackle brought in. Certainly the NFL draft is going to play a role in that as well. But as it looks right now, you can sort of have Mustipher, Borom, and Patrick and kind of say, okay, your 2 best are going to start at guard and center. And I'm sort of guessing Lucas Patrick is going to be one of the best there. He should be, in theory, a starter at either guard or center at this point. It's just a matter of whether they specifically want to slot him into one spot and say, this is your spot, and we're going to work on the other spot elsewhere in free agency in the draft, or whether they do want to open that up with the competition with some of the younger guys that they already have on the roster. Because that is the thing I'm curious about with Lucas Patrick, right? He played both guard and center at at least average starting caliber offensive line level. I do wonder if you gave him a whole offseason into a regular season at one position, if you might not be able to get even better play out of him just by giving him that stability, right? He seems to be able to handle both, but could he be even better if you didn't ask him to play multiple positions over the course of the same season? Could you get an average to above average starting caliber player if you were able to sit him there? Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I do think at the value the Bears have him here, right? 2 years, $8 million total, $4 million a year. If you could get average to above average play this season, maybe give him that full-time starting role, elevate him a little bit, and then next year he's under contract again for just $4 million. You could have yourself, in theory, a pretty good starting caliber offensive line for very relatively cheap. Because you look at some of the other offensive line contracts we've seen handed out so far. Brandon Scherf to the Jaguars for 3 years, almost $50 million. It's $16.5 million per year, 4 times what Lucas Patrick is getting. Also, maybe the best guard in football or one of the best guards in football, so should be paid more. But it was a high guard market of Scherf gets 16.5 a year. Laken Tomlinson gets 13 1/3. Alex Kappa gets 8 3/4 from the Bengals. James Daniels gets 8 1/3 from the Steelers. Austin Corbett gets just under 9 from the Panthers. Even Mark Glowinski goes from the Colts to the Giants for $6 million a year, right? Lucas Patrick slides in under all of those and is still starting caliber. Not Pro Bowl caliber, not as good as those guys, but like can get the job done. And whether that's the right approach or not for this offensive line is sort of a different question. I think it is good value for the type of player you're getting, for how much you're paying for him on the open free agent market. The real question is, should the Bears have done more for the offensive line, right? Is the offensive line a position that should be more prioritized, right? I mean, not necessarily that more money equals more priority and exactly always more money equals better player, right? But is that a position they should go value and cheap on, or should they have, ponied up a little bit more for, say, James Daniels? Is the difference in talent there worth it because the offensive line is so important to Justin Fields and the success of the offense, right? That's where the jury's still going to be out, right? We have to see what their full offensive line plan is going to be here. Signing one guard/center for Lucas Patrick is not the plan, presumably. If it is, there's room for criticism there, right? They should do more than just sign Lucas Patrick to replace James Daniels and say, all right, good enough, rub our hands together and say, that's it, offensive line is fixed. No, let's see what else they do first. But for now, I do think in a vacuum, it's good value. And if they're still able to properly rebuild the offensive line and get good value, that's a good idea, right? Obviously, you want to get good value, but the priority should be getting the best offensive line. And then if you can also get value with that, that's a bonus. But the value itself is not fully exactly what the Bears need. The Bears don't need good value on the offensive line. They need a good offensive line first and good value second. So we'll see how that offensive line starts to come together. Clearly, with those bigger contracts going out, the Bears were playing more of the long game here. Maybe they were in on some of those discussions, but they weren't willing to pay those prices for some of those players. We'll take a look kind of at what the Bears' free agent strategy has been so far with Larry Ogunjobi weighed against Lucas Patrick and what could be coming next on Locked On Bears. We thought the Chicago Bears might go the more patient, slow route in free agency coming out of the gate. And of course, kind of disrupted that and surprised us a bit with the signing of Larry Ogunjobi for $13 million a year, or a little over $13 million a year, a big deal for a three-technique defensive tackle, right? It was maybe seen by some as an overpay. Maybe it's what the free agent market was demanding at that point, but clearly that was a priority, I think, for Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. That position, they kind of said, you know what? We can't compromise at that defensive tackle position. We really feel like, right or wrong, right from our perspective on the outside, right or wrong, they really feel like that's the position they had to prioritize first and say, we need this at a premium in our defense because the free agent market is particularly weak at that spot. So they went out and paid for Larry Ogunjobi. And also, I think the very legitimate value and importance it has to this 4-3 defense in Matt Eberflus's scheme. We talked about it on yesterday's podcast, breaking down Larry Ogunjobi, which if you haven't listened to, please go back and kind of catch up on day one of the free agent action for the Bears. But like, we looked at how the Colts spent a lot of money and draft picks trading for and big contracts for those defensive tackle positions. They invested in that spot more than a lot of other teams. And so maybe then in hindsight, it's not as surprising that the Bears invested a lot there in Larry Ogunjobi. But since Ogunjobi, it was a very quiet Tuesday for the most part until late at night. They signed the linebacker and then, of course, Lucas Patrick. But like neither of those are big money deals. And the Bears really do seem to be sort of taking this like patient, slow and steady type of approach with, at least right now, it seems like the offensive line and wide receiver positions. And of course, like they haven't signed anybody else yet. So really it's been a little bit slow and steady for all of them. And slow is a relative term here because it's been 2 days. It's not like this has been 2 weeks and they're still waiting it out. But like, you know, in these first few days and hours, the big fish do tend to start to go. And the Bears have not been necessarily involved in that. They haven't wanted to pay $13 or $16 million for a top flight guard, or in this case, like in terms of wide receiver right now, $18 million a year for Christian Kirk from the Arizona Cardinals to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, that deal really, I think, disrupted the wide receiver market. Some of the rumblings have been like agents have been pretty mad that not so much agents, I guess teams have been mad. The agents have probably been happy that Christian Kirk signed that deal, but more like teams are now going to other teams. Agents are going to other teams in free agency and saying, well, Christian Kirk got 18. So my wide receiver, say Jarvis Landry or Allen Robinson or whoever, if Christian Kirk got 18, my wide receiver should get more than that and should get maybe significantly more than that, or however, whatever their negotiations are going to be. And teams are going, well, no, just because the Jaguars way overpaid for a slot wide receiver doesn't mean we're going to overpay. And that's why we haven't seen a ton of other big movement at receiver, right? DJ Chark signed with the Lions 1 year, $10 million, kind of a 1 year prove it type deal. And then it's been like Zay Jones, Russell Gage, and Cedric Wilson, right? Not household names, not number one receivers, not really top guys there. Still signing for fairly decent amount. Russell Gage got 3 years and $30 million from the Buccaneers to come from the Falcons, excuse me. And Zay Jones goes to the Jaguars for another $8 million a year. Cedric Wilson to the Dolphins for just over $7 million a year. But you still have a fairly robust wide receiver free agent market sitting out there that the Bears have been reportedly interested in Marquez Valdez-Scantling, maybe dabbling in some other guys. But I think much like they were sort of waiting for those offensive linemen to come off and then go get a Lucas Patrick for cheap, I'm expecting something similar to happen at wide receiver. And it's kind of impossible to predict exactly who that's going to be and who teams are going to absolutely love and who they're not. Bears were, again, reportedly on Valdez-Scantling, and also Juju Smith-Schuster has been a name they've been connected to. Now, again, I don't think they're going to want to pay top dollar necessarily when they feel like, okay, there are a lot of wide receivers out there, and somebody should potentially come a little bit cheaper. And until they do, maybe you wait and maybe Allen Robinson signs somewhere else and Jarvis Landry signs somewhere else and AJ Green or Sammy Watkins or whoever signs other places, and the Bears start missing out, quote unquote, on more of these wide receivers. And then they end up getting really good value on, I mean, I don't know, D.D. Westbrook, Demarcus Robinson. I don't know, right? Throw a name out there like Adam Humphries, somebody like that like is not a number one wide receiver, but can be a good complement to Darnell Mooney and part of the wide receiver rebuild, right? There's going to need to be at least a draft pick and a free agent signed, if not a couple free agents signed and maybe a couple draft picks, and it's probably a bigger picture move, and maybe they find some more value later in free agency, right? But I think we're going to continue to see a little bit more so slow and steady to see how other teams spend at wide receiver. The same way we've seen a lot of the top guards and centers start to come off the market, and then the Bears swoop in and say, okay, Lucas Patrick, you're our guy, come in and let's go that way. Because we haven't really seen a lot of, say, offensive tackles come off the board just yet. So maybe they're waiting a little bit in that market too, right? Teron Armstead from the Saints is kind of the big fish that hasn't really fallen yet. Trenton Brown from the Patriots, still kind of sitting out there unsigned at the time that I'm recording this, that this all changes kind of quickly. Or Dwayne Brown from the Seahawks, Riley Reif from the Bengals, Eric Fisher from the Colts, right? There's a lot of tackles out there too, a lot of veteran offensive tackles that haven't really gone yet. I see Ryan Poles is sort of like, it's easy to sort of envision him like, okay, need my 3 technique. We'll go get our guy. Everything else, we like our options. We think there's a lot of depth in free agency. Let's see where we can get some value here and start to build some foundational pieces for this team, because there is a lot of holes to fill. Plus, cornerbacks, safety, maybe another linebacker, maybe another defensive tackle to replace Eddie Goldman, right? There's more holes that need to be filled on this roster, and I don't think you're going to see them make any. They're not in a hurry to make big splashes at a bunch of other positions. They still want to get good players, right? And again, we'll see whether the slow and steady method here proves to be correct. You still need good players. You can get good value all day long, but if you get good value on a bunch of mediocre players and then have a mediocre team, that's a problem, right? You do need to get good players even while you're getting good value. Same thing like the Lucas Patrick discussion applies everywhere else. Value is great, but talent is slightly more important than value. And then you want value with your talent, but you do need talent. And I don't know, can you make a whole roster out of average Lucas Patrick starting caliber players? You certainly can. Is that the best way to build your team? We'll sort of see, right? That's how we're taking the approach with Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles here. We're going to wait to fully criticize and judge the whole process until we see the rest of free agency and what they prioritize and what they don't and what holes are left afterward. And then we can start to say, okay, did they put their money where they needed to and all that? But for now, we can evaluate the things sort of individually in a little bit of a vacuum and say, okay, Lucas Patrick, good value. Larry Ogunjobi, maybe a little bit overpaid, but here's why it could be good and why it could not be good. And same with Lucas Patrick. I guess he could end up not really giving you a lot of consistency there, right? There's always room for ups and downs in both of these, but that's what the fun part of free agency is. And of course, no one wins Super Bowls in March and April in free agency. And as much as teams win the offseason, that doesn't always directly translate to winning in the regular season. Just look at the Jacksonville Jaguars. No matter how free agency keeps sort of moving forward as the league year actually starts today, as the podcast is coming out, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you 5 days a week right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. But if you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On Podcast Network is doing a college basketball bracket preview podcast. You can search for the Ultimate College Basketball Preview Podcast wherever you get your podcast. Plus, we've got Locked On shows, not for every college in the country, but most of the major programs across the country. The Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day, getting you all set for March Madness and so much more. Plus, Locked On Bears podcast has your team every day, and hopefully, as a result, making it just a little bit easier for you to bear down.